What is up, everyone? Welcome to Elasmocast. Today's a really cool episode because we are going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite sharks, Ptychodus. And we have one of the world's foremost experts on Ptychodus here to talk about it with us. Welcome, Shawn Hamm, to Elasmocast. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah. So before we get into Ptychodus, tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into paleontology.
Well, when I was in high school in the Dallas Fort Worth area, on the weekends, your friends go out, you do a little hunting, you do a little fishing, and fishing one day we were in a creek and there were all these odd things just poking out of and sitting on the ground. They were ammonites. Of course, I had no clue what they were, so I started picking them up, and before too long I had more ammonites in my hands and I had fish in my bag. So that just kind of started my journey just of curiosity and what are these things and how in the heck did they get there. And then when I came to Kansas, it all turned to vertebrates and sharks after that. So yeah, it just kind of started off as curiosity as a kid, and here I am as a much older adult now, still as curious as ever, still looking for the new fossil, the next new fossil.
Yeah. And Ptychodus is really a prevalent shark throughout the Western Interior Seaway. For those that don't know, North America was essentially split in half vertically from this large seaway that was pretty shallow throughout the Cretaceous. And Ptychodus is really one of the most prevalent fossils, depending on where you're collecting at those places. So, what got you into Ptychodus specifically?
Well, in 1995, I actually found my first Ptychodus tooth. And not only was it a tooth, but it was a whole set of teeth. And I had no clue what I was looking at. And after I had collected, I was going around and looking and talking to people at my university, and everybody went, I don't know, try contacting this person. And I contact that person, and they were like, I don't know. And then contact this person. Well, I think it's Ptychodus. Okay. So they gave me some references. I looked them up, and okay, yeah, sure. That's nice. So then I actually was put in touch with Henri Capetta in France, and then Gerald Case here in New Jersey. This is back again in the early to mid 90s. And they both said the same thing. It's Ptychodus. And I'm kind of like everybody else. Well, okay, you gave me a name. And the advice that was given to me by Henri Capetta was, well, go learn about it and figure it out, and you let me know what it is. Okay. So then that's what led me on my journey to figure out what these things were. So, and it just piqued my interest. And the more I learned about Ptychodus, the more I became enthralled with the family. And the more it got me collecting throughout the Western Interior Seaway. And here we are all these years later, and I'm still working on Ptychodus. There's still a lot to do.
There really is. And let's talk about the history of the classification of Ptychodus and what Ptychodus actually is for those that don't know about it.
Oh, this is a torturous animal right here for us. Um, humans really learned about and actually were discussing Ptychodus teeth as early as the 1720s. And a lot of times when they would find teeth over in England and France, they were just isolated teeth. And so here you've got this oddball tooth. And for the time period that they were finding teeth, they were relatively large in size compared to what we find here in the Western Interior. And so looking at just modern taxa, well, what could this thing belong to? Well, porcupine fish have one great big tooth in the upper and lower tooth jaws. And they thought, oh, well, this has got to be an ancient, just giant porcupine fish. And then in the latter part of the 1700s, 1800s, now all of a sudden they're finding tooth plates, not just single teeth, but plates with rows and rows of teeth of multiple sizes. And then so that got them to rethinking, ooh, it's probably not a porcupine fish. What do we have that's related? Oh, it's got to be a myliabated. It's got to be a ray, because that's the only other modern analog there is to a dentition with flat pavement teeth and multiple rows. So Causier back in oh boy, the late 1880s or so was the one that was putting some of that information together. They had nothing else to work on. You just have just teeth. There's no vertebrae, there's no denticles, there's nothing else. I think Woodward in the early 1900s finally found some jaw fragments. Wow, okay, great. Now what do we do? Well, it gave us some more information, but nothing else to go on. So it still kind of kept along the idea of that we're probably a ray of some kind. And then some people went, no, you know what? These teeth look like these hybodont teeth that we know we've got complete sharks of. Look at the tooth root. It's got to be a hybodont. It has to be, it has to be, it has to be. And it was really that way all the way up until even 2012. There were still some arguments. Some researchers wanted to keep it as a hybodont versus some of the ideas I had back in the early 2000s of it being a Neoselachian. So it's just gathering more evidence and gathering more evidence to kind of change the idea of what it was for 200 years to what we think it is now today. So it's been a long and torturous journey. And I think we've got it figured out, but there's still a little argument on where it should be classified, whether it is a lambdaform or it should be its own family.
Hmm.
So that's what I'm dealing with right now today. So
Yeah, and what got you into thinking that this was a Neo-Salacian when a lot of other people were leaning on the Hybodont side?
there was actually a partial skeleton found in the 1970s in the Niobrara Chalk in Kansas. And when I was able to get a hold of it and do my research with it, I was like, ooh, now wait a minute. Not only does it have a box-like conocranium, not only does it have, you know, a long, or excuse me, a short hyomandibular and all these other skeletal characteristics, the differentiated dermodenticles from oral denticles, you know, within the jaw cavity itself to different differentiated dermodenticles along the side of the body. You've got some that are fast moving denticles that have got really neat ridges in them that's indicative of a shark that moves and swims really, really fast. So think of like a great white shark today. You know, they're pretty fast moving predators. And then the size of the vertebrae, the thickness of the vertebrae. And you see, you know, like the dorsal fin, the pectoral fin, these things are huge. And so that's not you know, indicative of anything that's slow lumbering and hanging out the bottom of an anoxic ocean feeding on clamshells. This is an open water active predator that these, you know, all the modern active predators we have with all of these characteristics are Neoselachians. We don't have anything like that at all in the fossil record. So that's
Yeah.
what was leading to me. The additional skeletal information was leaning me towards that Neoselachian um, classification.
Yeah, and their vertebrae are very reminiscent too of specifically galleon sharks too, which
Yes,
I
they are.
think further supports that. And one of the things that was initially used to support a hybridont classification was earlier studies that found a single layered enameloid, but then subsequent studies have found no, this actually has an enameloid structure more indicative of a Neo-Salacian, and especially a Salacian like a proper shark,
Yes.
enameloid structure.
Yeah, the triple layered enameloid. Yes. Yeah, that early study that you're mentioning, I don't think they actually sliced into the dentine far enough to get to the other layers of enameloid for them to see the other two. So yeah, that pretty much blew that one out of the water. Yeah,
Yeah,
but that was
so
an interesting study though.
yeah, and for a while I ran with your classification of these being within Ptychodontiforms, having
Mhm.
their own separate order because
Yes.
yeah, they resemble, you know, especially the dentition wise and the vertebrae wise, a galleon placement. However, there are some differences with the teeth that make it, you know, pretty ambiguous where it actually fits in. And that was really up until the newest paper from Vulo et al. On Ptychodus describing those articulated remains from Mexico, which definitely supports your hypothesis that this was a fast-moving shark. I mean, looking at those articulated body plans, I think it made it very clear that they are, you know, an active predatory shark. One of the things that I'm a little hesitant on as far as stating thoroughly that yes, this is definitely a lamniform. I think that it does lean lamniform based on that material, but it's not set in stone because when we think about Ptychodus and what makes it unique in their jaw structure and their dentition plan, One of the bases for labeling it as a lamniform was where its jaw sits back behind, the rest of its head, which is a classical lamniform trait, but it's not exclusive to lamniforms. When you have an animal that is so unique because of its dentition and jaw structure, I think classifying it based on that principle is not something that like says this is set in stone that it has to be this, that there is some possibility for more work to be done in the future. That who knows, maybe it is a lamniform, maybe it's not, but there's more to it, I think, than meets the eye.
Oh, I agree 100%. And looking at that paper, it was a really well written paper for the data that they have. However, when you get a phylogenetic analysis, you get a cladogram that has over 6,000 most parsimonious trees. That's a wide gray area as far as where the critter should fall, right?
Hmm.
And you're absolutely correct. With the type of dentition that it has, it does not follow Campagno's or Shimada's lamnoid tooth formula or tooth dentition, which is what they had set forth for the senstricto definition of a lamniform. And Ptychodus clearly does not fall within that lamnoid pattern. Now, body wise, body form, yes. So it's a convergent body form that I would expect to see in all fast moving sharks. And you do see that amongst even squaliform sharks. They do have these lamniform type bodies and are still, pretty fast swimmers. So the body form itself, I think, is a convergent form of evolution. And the like you were just mentioning before, just not just the dentition, but the way that it's actually attached to the brain case. I believe that makes Ptychodus fall within its own family, henceforth the
Hmm.
Ptychodontiforms,
And
compared to, but it's still a galeomorph, right? It's still within the Galeomorpha. So it's just going to be a basal to the lamniforms. So you've got kind of heterodontous, Ptychodus, then your lamniforms, and so on and so forth.
yeah.
So it's nested in there, but not specifically within the lamniforms itself.
Yeah, and I thought it was pretty set in stone for a while after reading that Vulo paper because, like you said, it is extremely well written and it's pretty convincing. One of my aha moments that, wait, there might be more to it than meets the eye was looking at another shark that you described, a close relative, Ptychodus, and I was looking at one of those teeth and I was like, wait a second, there is a uvula on this, and there's an apron on this, and this is a
Mm-hmm.
basal shark.
Mm-hmm.
So those are traits that are typically found in erectolobiforms, not lamniforms at all. And the fact that the basal ones had that meant that there's a likelihood that these could actually be more closely related to the erectolobiforms, but have like you said, a convergently similar body plan to lamniforms, which are closely related to erectolobiforms.
Yes, absolutely. Peritychotus actually is an interesting story in itself. I'm sure you're aware of Meyer's work, 1974, I believe, at SMU. He was the first one to actually describe it as Ptychodus affinity decurrens in the early 70s, and that first domino fall right there has researchers today, which I've been trying to correct this issue for years now. Everybody still wants to refer to all of these earlier tooth forms as decurrens when they're not decurrens.
Mhm.
Most of these are Peritychodus. And it's interesting because I looked at that tooth, I looked at the type specimen, I went, huh, that's not Ptychodus. It's close. I mean, it's really close. And just like you were just mentioning a moment ago, that has more affinities to other taxa than Ptychodus. But it's kind of boy, is that close. You could really, with it, with not having a trained eye, you
Mhm.
could easily see and put it into this pile over here,
Yeah.
right? And when the next researcher comes along and they look at that pile again, the untrained eye said, "Oh, you know what? Ben identified that as that. We're just going to roll with it." And you can kind of see how taxonomically things don't change when
Mhm.
you take what one person has. identified and not going back and look at it closer. So I looked at that tooth. And I went back to the type locality and I collected more material. And I had people who had been collecting that locality for decades actually bring me material and some of the posterior teeth. And I looked at that, I'm like, there is no way this is Ptychodus. There is no way whatsoever. And like I say, you look at those posterior erectolobe form sharks and how are they? They've got these nice triangular pointed crowns. That is exactly what we see in a little heterodoniform, a little more heterodony, I should say, in the teeth within the dentition of Ptychodus.
Mhm.
And looking at other taxa, well, who is this going to be more closely related to? If you look at some of the near shore and even brackish water sharks like Heteroptychodus
Mhm.
and some of those forms, boy oh boy, there it just fills a gap from near shore, close water marine, and then bam, right into Ptychodus, open marine animals, and it's just it was like the perfect taxa to fill in that gap, both morphologically and stratigraphically.
Yeah.
So
And I would say if Ptychodus didn't exist, if nobody found that, then I would probably agree wholeheartedly that Ptychodus was a lamniform based on that paper. But like even the tooth-based structure resembles what you would expect on a more erectolobiform affinity to taxa. Like you
mhm.
pair that plus that foramen that you see, that central foramen on the basal side of it, with that extending out apron and uvula, there's way more to it than meets the eye. And that kind of leads me into another thing I wanted to ask you is what are your thoughts as far as the phylogeny within Ptychodontidae and where you think that these things place? Do you think that Heteroptychodus was ancestral to some of these other ones, or do you think it's like a separate lineage, maybe convergently related? What do you
I
think?
think that, yeah, I think that's convergent related. In with Heteroptychodus, it has a really, really close affinity to freshwater hybodonts in Southeast Asia. So
Hmm.
if you take a look at Tribodus and the like, I can see a very, very close relationship there compared to Paraptychodus on the other side of the world now. And looking at again some of those freshwater forms moving into with Paraptychodus. The big thing is you got to look at when you're looking at tooth forms like this is it's not just the tooth itself, but it's the environment that the sharks are living in as well. So, what are the food sources that are available? What is the driving factor in the evolution of the tooth form itself? It's not just the tooth; it's what's the driving motivator for this. And if you take a look at the available food, you start with Paraptychodus, and you've got these itty bitty tiny little micromorph ammonite taxa, and they're everywhere in the middle albumin. I mean, everywhere. The middle albumin all the way to the Cinnamanian, the early Cinnamanian. That's where we see the cutoff for Paraptychodus. Then you get deeper water, and then you get larger ammonites, and then now all of a sudden we start to see bam, big diversity in the Cinnamanian and Turonian to our low crown forms, which you start with something like Ptychodus marginalis, nice, low, wide dome tooth in the Cinnamanian and then the middle Turonian, then bam, it's gone. What happened to it? Well, shoot, you got latissimus that's now come over from Europe and it's taken its place. Latissimus only hangs out for a short stratigraphic time period, and bam, it's replaced. It's gone. And then Ptychodus martini, and you follow this form all the way through. And martini lasts a long time, and then bam, it's gone. And then polygyrus, and it's the last low crown Ptychodid in the fossil record. So you can see a clear path and morphology along those lines with that tooth form. And you see the same thing with some of the higher crowns. Now you get more, when I ran a phylogenetic analysis on these, you get more polytomies with the relationships here. So, but it's still interesting to see anonymous in the early to middle Cinnamanian. That nice high bulbous crown takes off with Whipplei. And then you've got a middle Turonian to late Turonian Whipplei, and then you've got a late Turonian, early Coniacean Whipplei. It's massive. And then bam, all of a sudden it's gone. And then you get big, massive Ptychodus rugosus teeth. Same tooth morphology. You get in that middle Turonian now all of a sudden on the other side of the world over there in Italy and middle Europe, you get another form that looks almost exactly like Whippley, Ptychodus elevatus. And so we do have some switching off. We do have some anagenetic drift in the genetic population moving around the world. But again, you can still follow those clear morphologic steps and stratigraphic steps, and you can clearly see there are relationships there. It is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
It's
And
still a lot to go, but yeah, it's really, really interesting.
I do agree with you on Heterotychodus being convergently similar tooth-wise to Tychodus because like you said, if we look at it more holistically from a phylogenetic standpoint, if you have this basal Tychodontid with, say, an apron and a uvula that eventually gets reduced out, which is why you don't see that in your regular Tychodus teeth, and you see Heterotychodus, which doesn't have any of those what would be considered basal traits, then it doesn't make sense that that would gain these traits that are usually considered plesiomorphic and then lose them again. And you see similar type of ridging patterns in durophagous dentitions within chondrichthyans appear, like you see Tychocorax, for example, with their posterior teeth. They have a similar type of thing going. You see even some batoids have similar pavement style teeth with those thick folds and ridging in the Cretaceous. So there's a lot of convergence that happens in tooth design. And one of the things I wanted to ask you regarding the high crown versus the low crown teeth is what do you think some of the benefits were for developing that higher crown compared to having a more lower crown form?
Again, it's going to be based on those food sources. If you take a look at the cephalopod diversity at that time, when you take a look at some of those cephalopods, they all didn't live in the free out open water. Some of those lived within the middle part of the water column, and some of them were completely basal. So it depended on the size and thickness of the shells. So if you've got something large like an adult Calignoceras, that has all these horns on it for protected, for it to protect itself, is it going to be better for you to have a high crown form that has a very narrow pinching point on it to try to get through one of those big massive shells, or it'd be better to have a nice big flat pavement tooth with big high thick sharp ridges to crunch those things? So I think that's where you start to get your differences in tooth morphologies from low to high crown, is who is feeding on what and at what part of the water column are they feeding.
Hmm.
What the real interesting thing gets to be is when you start to get stratigraphically non-overlapping taxa that have convergent tooth forms. That is a very interesting problem or idea that I'm dealing with or have been dealing with for the past decade or so. And it's that will be an interesting paper that will be out soon. So
I'm
yes,
excited to see
there
it.
are a lot of things going on ecologically that's driving these phenotypic changes within the family.
So walk me through some of your diagnostic processes for identifying Tychodus teeth, because your master's thesis is largely considered like the Tychodus Bible.
I
And
appreciate
you
that.
really are like unparalleled with your Tychodus tooth identification knowledge. So how do you go about identifying these teeth?
Well, the first thing that I do is I look at where the tooth is stratigraphically. Where did it come from? Because there are so many close similarities in tooth designs within, let's just say, the low crown taxa. And we know that there are up to and exceeding 10 tooth rows on either side of the central median tooth file. So that's 10 different tooth shapes, and that's 10 different tooth morphologies just on one side of the dentition alone. And we know that the lower medial tooth file, the largest tooth in the dentition, that's the most diagnostic tooth form. Well, unfortunately, not all of the type specimens are based on the lower medial tooth. So that's what makes things interesting as well. So number one for me is stratigraphy. Where exactly did it come from? And then number two, let's say it is a low crown form. Well, I know if it is a Cinnamanian to Middle Turonian taxa, we've pretty much nailed that down to Ptychodus marginalis because it's the only one that existed at the time. Now, can we get that to tooth file position? Yeah, we can do that. So now we're going to be taking a look at overall tooth shape, right? So we can tell if it is more rectangular, excuse me, if it's more square, it's more towards the midline, the center of the jaw. If it becomes more rectangular, then we know we are further out into the lateral margins of the dentition. That is very key as well. We want to know exactly where that tooth is from. And so now the next thing I want to look at is the tooth ridge pattern. The tooth ridge pattern gives it away. And again, depending on that tooth file, if we say we are marginalis, that tooth, those ridges are going to come right across the apex, out to the edge of the tooth, out towards the apron where the margin is, and they're going to curl. They're going to have a little bit of a curl to them, and the margin itself is going to be nice and granular. Now, on a marginalis tooth, it's not granular concentric, it's just on the mesial and distal portions. On the anterior tooth form, it's going to start to bifurcate a little bit with a few little heterodontic bumps on it. It's really, really neat. And that pattern continues all the way down the line to your most posterior files, but that apron, anterior apron, disappears. So stratigraphically, that is the key. Because if I were to take a, let's say, a late Coniacian, late Coniacian to Santonian Ptychodus martini tooth, and lay it down next to a marginalis tooth of a certain tooth file position, you will never tell them apart. Very, 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 very difficult to tell them apart. Now, there are a few things you need to look for, but again, stratigraphy is key when doing that. And it took me a lot of years and looking at tens and tens of thousands of teeth to be able to get a system in place like that to be able to accurately identify Ptychodus teeth.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I get people that send me pictures all the time. Hey, what is this? And where did it come from? Well, I don't know. I said, well, it could be this or it could be this. Like, I got to know where it's at stratigraphically because some of those characters are really, really, really close. Again, just like your previous question, what are some of the in family relationships? You know, marginalis, martini, and polygyrus are three perfect examples of that. The tooth morphology is very, very, very close to one another. So having that little bit more information is key to making some of those identifications. The ones that are more difficult are the higher crown taxa. Say your Mortoni's. And this is kind of what we got into a moment ago. Is there are so many different types out there that can be ascribed to Mortoni that do not conform to the type specimen whatsoever. And we have complete to nearly complete dentitions of all of these different forms. Now what? Do I have 12 more species out there that need to yet be identified? Do we have something along the lines of what I was mentioning before with anagenetic drift within a family, like we see with modern carchariniforms? I'm not quite sure if you know much about them, but if you go to the eastern coast of the United States today, there's 15 modern carchariniform sharks today swimming around the East Coast. And the only differences between some of these are very, very, very minor variations in the teeth, but bigger variations within the anatomy of the physical, body anatomy. But in the fossil record, if we only see some of these minor variations, are they all still one particular taxa, or are they now all different species? And we have a very, 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 very difficult time doing that in the fossil record, especially if you only have maybe one or two dentitions to try to help with that. So now you start to get into a lot of gray, muddy areas when making those kinds of taxonomic identifications. So it can still get a little muddy at times.
Yeah, and especially
I don't know if I thoroughly answered your question or not, but
you did, yeah. So one of the issues with the fossil record is obviously we're looking at a narrow glimpse of this animal. Most of these sharks are known based on their teeth only. Some with Ptychodus we're lucky enough to get tooth plates, and rarely you'll get entire articulated remains. But like with modern sharks, a lot of species too are differentiated based on mostly genetics. So some of them might not even have any discernible tooth differences. Some of them may have just like vertebral count differences, which we wouldn't know based on isolated teeth. And then, yeah, with the minute variations of teeth, you have certain things like bull sharks. You have ecological changes in their teeth depending on where they're located. You have same thing with like blue sharks. And yeah, it's really a challenge to figure out what's actually a new taxa and what is something that we're seeing based on like an ecomorph of the same taxa. So it really is a complex thing. And then dealing with things like transitional fossils and things like that, it's a mess.
Well, it's also trying to identify, do we have a male versus a female? What ontogenetic stage? Is it a juvenile? Is it a subadult? Is it a full adult? Did female Ptychodus go through seasonal changes in the dentition, particularly when it comes to having pups? Because there are some taxa where the female's teeth change seasonally due to breeding season, which is also very interesting. And we see some examples of that here in the Niobrara Chalk in Kansas. We see some late Turonian, late Coniacian, early Santonian forms of these really, really weird tooth forms. It falls within what we would call Ptychodus mortoni, but they are complete, and they're within dentitions. They're within whole dentitions that are completely wacky compared to every other dentition that's found within the same time period. So what's happening there? Could that be an example of one of those seasonal changes? Could that be an example of, yes, we definitely do have a female at this point in her, in her ontogenetic, ontogenetic stage? Is she, at full maturity at that, the more information you get, it's almost the more questions we have.
I agree thoroughly
Yeah.
on that.
So
Yeah, no, it's
there's a lot of biology, modern biology that you've really got to look at to try to make some of these determinations. Most people think you can just take a tooth and look at a tooth and go, oh yeah, 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 this is exactly what it is. Well, there's a lot more to it than, oh yeah, there's a tooth. I can give you an identification. I can tell you where it falls within the dentition. Can I tell you if it's male or female? Can I tell you what ontogenetic stage that tooth could potentially be in? No, I can't tell you that. But I can at least give you one piece of the puzzle that you can definitely take to the bank and go, yeah, that's what I have here. But
mhm.
that's only one small piece of the overall puzzle.
Yeah.
That makes any sense.
It does. And hopefully we can eventually get larger sample sizes from Mexico, for example, that would allow us to get a better idea of, say, like you said, sexual dimorphism on tooth dentitions and things like that, and different ontogenetic stages. That would really help a lot when trying to figure this stuff out.
Well, we do have a couple other specimens that are out there right now. There are some now. You got to get into the human aspect of and the science business aspect of what can we do with the specimen because of where it's located.
Hmm.
It's within private hands. There are some strict rules by the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology of, yeah, we could describe this thing, but we can't publish it. Who knows where that specimen is going to end up in 5, 10, 15 years. And trying to get people to really want to work with scientists sometimes can be very, very, very difficult, even though that we know that there are specimens out there that will make big sweeping changes in our field. And it's not just with a skeleton, it's with tooth sets that we have never seen before for a particular species that's sitting in somebody's garage right now. Or they literally have it in a shoebox that is hiding in a closet in the basement. And yes, these are things I have witnessed. And these would be great to work with. I can't, I can't even put the suppositions out there based on, hey, I have seen. Well, I have seen means nothing if we don't have access to those things. And that makes it very, very difficult. One that's a real heartbreaker is Ptychodus occidentalis from the Cinnamanian. I don't know if you're aware of this taxon or not, but big bulbous type teeth. Very, very, very fine, but a ton of fancy tooth crown patterns. The ridges aren't very thick, but for some reason, this shark very, very, very quickly got really big. And there is one tooth that I know of that's sitting in a collection out there that you could play softball with. It is a massive tooth, but it will never see the light of day because it will never come out of, a private collection, which is kind of sad because that could have really given us a lot more insights into the gigantic, how these things got to be so huge, in particular this taxa at such an early stage of evolution of Ptychodus. How in the heck did it get so big so fast and then just disappear? So that's kind of some of the disappointing parts of science, especially when you're working with a taxa like this. That we have a ton of questions, and we know that there's specimens out there, but we just can't do anything with them. It's kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah. So that segues us into another question that I wanted to ask because a lot of people don't realize it, but Ptychodus was large. So how large did Ptychodus get, and what were some of the largest taxa?
Well, Ptychodus did get large. Like I was saying before with Ptychodus occidentalis, especially during the Middle Cinnamanian like that. I don't know. The only thing that when you look at taxa, it doesn't matter whether they're marine or if they're terrestrial. Keep in mind that the environment, I keep going back to that because that's one of the, it's true. The environment drives your size. There's got to be a food source out there that's large enough, i.e., there's more than enough of it, and you are the one that has outcompeted everybody else for that food source. When that food source is gone, then you're gone. So very few taxa as we go through from the Cinnamanian to really the early Coniacian. That's where you get your most diversity. But the sharks themselves, looking at the Mexican and Texan specimens, are about 5 feet in length. So that's really not that big. If you look at something like Ptychodus and you look at tooth size versus tooth length, that thing could have been 2 to 3 feet in length max. So Ptychodus stays a pretty, keep it, let's just say the largest would be about 6 feet, all the way till you get to the Coniacian. Then all of a sudden, bam, major environment changes. Seaway gets a lot deeper. It gets a lot less oxygenated. And so now your food source has drastically changed. And then your species diversity just gets decimated. So there are very few taxa that make it in the Western Interior Seaway. Now you're down to Ptychodus mortoni, you're down to Ptychodus martini, and you're down to Ptychodus rugosus from the late Coniacian all the way to the end, late Santonian, early Campanian. You're down to 3 taxa. So diversity is just shot. It's just chopped down. Major, major, major changes in the seaway. Now, they don't have competition, do they, at this time? They are now all able to feed at different trophic levels within the same seaway, feeding on different invertebrate and vertebrate taxa. You keep in mind, you still have small turtles. You do have small squid, Tessiteuthis, and things along those lines. You have belemnites. You have big texanites and larger ammonites for them all to feed on. Euendocrinus, floating crinoids and things. So there's a wide, diverse range of food sources. And if you have no competition and the food source stays constant, you are able to attain gigantic sizes. So as the seaway starts to retreat during the Campanian, okay, so the seaway, you got some orogeny going on in the western part of the United States. The Pacific plate is diving. The North American craton is rising. We're starting to get the Rocky Mountains, and the seaway is now draining south. So that's shallowing up. We're getting warmer waters. And now we're getting more and more other taxa, shark and ray taxa coming along, particularly the myliabatids. Now the myliabatids start to get more diverse, and they're going to be eating on the same food sources. And then all of a sudden, we get this other critter, this large mosasaur, which develops a durophagous dentition, globidens alabamaensis. Now you've got a huge population of large animals that are now feeding on the same food sources that, like you, hey, wait a minute, this is my buffet. Then all of a sudden, your buffet disappears, and now you've been outcompeted at two trophic levels for the same food sources. So that size you had that you used to outcompete everybody with, now the smaller ones are coming in and outcompeting you. And getting larger is not a biological benefit for you at this point, right? And biologically, you're not going to get smaller at this point either. And so that is what we see at the end Santonian, early Campanian. Ptychodus is just completely outcompeted. It has actually over specialized itself as a taxon and specialized itself into extinction.
Yeah. It is really, really cool, but sad seeing in the companion. That was really a big shock to a lot of these larger sharks like Ptychodus, but also Cretaceous
That's a
being,
minute.
yeah.
Skullcorax. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. Absolutely.
Squalocorax is another one that, like you were saying, I suspect it's probably like a Carcharanus type of deal where you had a bunch of different sharks with similar dentitions doing similar things, but we don't really have that full picture.
Right. And you can take a look at Squalocorax. I know I don't want to diverge too much off of Ptychodus, but if you take a look at its evolutionary history, you see the same kind of thing. As you get back into the early middle Albion, Squalocorax, they're pretty small. They're really pretty tiny. It takes all the way up until the late Coniacian for all of a sudden for you to get Squalocorax of any what we want to call a decent size, anything over a centimeter and a half size tooth. And then when you get to the Santonian, oh boy, now all bets are off. All your small sharks, your small anacrassids are gone, and now you're down to um, oh my goodness, I just lost it. Hartwelli, you're down to crassidens, and you're down to crassidens. Oh my goodness, sorry, I lost it. There's one more in there. It'll come to me in a second. You're down to those three. And then by the Campanian, they're gone. Now you're down to Pristodontis. And then poof, at the end Cretaceous, now you move on to some of the more Eocene taxa, but bam, they're gone. That's it. So same thing with Ptychodus. They become really, really, really specialized, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then all of a sudden, bam, they're gone. So you see the same playbook again occurring in the same marine setting for another taxa that's analogous to Ptychodus. Over specialization does not always mean you're going to last forever.
What is interesting though with Squalocorax that's a little bit different than like your Ptychodus and your Cretaceous is that when Squalocorax reaches the end Maastrichtian, you see, at least in Morocco, an explosion in size. Like you're talking like 2 inch plus
Mm-hmm.
Prisonantis teeth,
Mm-hmm.
which is
That's
absurd. That must have been a pretty large shark. And then you also see these monstrous Scapanarhynchus teeth too coming out of Morocco too right before then. So there is like a blip where sharks decrease in size, but they do sort of bounce back. But then the end Maastrichtian extinction happens, and then that's gone.
Yeah, and again, take a look at the depositional environment in which those sharks are found. You're going to an area there in Morocco where we're talking about, seaway that's less than 500 feet deep. Nice, big, open, well oxygenated part of the seaway with massive and abundant food sources. So you've seen all the other taxa that have come out of there, the non-vertebrate taxa. The amount of, the buffet was wide open and everybody's welcome. But as soon as that seaway starts to get deeper and deeper and deeper, what happens to all of the taxa? Food sources are gone, they die off. And if you're a top apex predator, that's it, right? It's
Yeah.
lights out.
And
Yeah.
that turnover really did kind of set the stage for, in the Paleocene, an explosion in diversity of sand sharks.
Mm-hmm.
But then, most important for a lot of people is the explosion of the odontids in size.
Oh,
That
yes.
that
Yes.
extinction really allowed them to blossom
Yeah.
post KPG extinction.
One of the things I've had to conversations I've had with avocational paleontologists with some of these same questions, and going back, you were talking about the reasons why. Why did Ptychodus get so huge? Well, we just discussed that, right? Why did Cretaceous all of a sudden, bam, gone? Why do odontopsids start off these itty bitty little things and all of a sudden, bam, you get these massive ones? Their food sources. I keep going back to this. If you think about this, look at the way invertebrates reproduce. Right. So the females, they throw billions of eggs into the water column. Males throw billions of sperm in the water column. They come in, they commingle, and then they drift off throughout the seaway, and it's a continuous cycle. So invertebrates, that's just from one male and one female. Now imagine that over millions and billions of invertebrates at the same time. So they are able to reproduce exponentially faster than vertebrates can. It takes 9 months for us to make one human on average, right? For some shark taxa, it takes 15 months. So when you finally get to the size, evolutionary wise, you get to that size, it takes a vertebrate much, much, much longer to get to those giant sizes compared to the invertebrate taxa, which can change on a dime in geologic time.
Hmm.
So your food source, you go back to your middle school, your food pyramid, when the bottom part of your food pyramid, where everybody is reliant on for energy for food, and they go like that, if you're that top apex predator, no matter who you are, right, it's all over. And it's just getting those biological, hey, why? Well, it just goes back to, hey, understanding the process of a food pyramid, understanding why your large macrophagous forms, no matter what they are, how they got there and why, and how they topple and how they can go extinct so fast, so fast. And it goes back to the lower trophic levels. And once those food sources die out and they're gone, if you're at the top, yeah, it's never a good day for you, right?
Yeah, and also take into consideration too with a lot of these larger sharks is that it takes a long time for them to reach sexual maturity. When
Yes.
they give birth, a lot of them have very small litters. So when you pair that with some environmental changes, that makes them even more susceptible to extinction, which we're seeing some of the vulnerabilities right now with a lot of sharks like the lamniforms that suffer from this very issue.
Oh yeah, ovoviparity is, it's a thing. It's there are a lot of sharks where brothers and sisters are eating them before they're born. That's something to consider as well. And again, if you're a newborn of anything in the ocean, you're food for somebody else. So that statistical, number of, can you survive going through gestation? Can you survive out away from mom? Can you survive being eaten by somebody else and grow large enough for you to continue the cycle? Yeah, those numbers, as you get along, get smaller, 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 don't they?
Yeah. And why do you think that we don't see anything like Ptychodus anymore? We don't see any of these really large, fast swimming, durophagous pelagic predators in
Mhm.
our oceans today.
And I think it goes right back to the food sources. Take a look at what we got out there today. Um, the majority of its food sources were ammonites, belemnites, baculidids, um, squids. If you take a look at what we got for squids now, for cephalopods now, um, the modern nautilus, they're pretty regular. They're pretty, I say regulated, restricted in their environments for where they're at. They've done a great job of hiding away from predators for that line to continue. So you don't have the continuing food source, what is coming in. So we got a lot more fish taxa and we got a lot more myliobatids and batoids that can feed on much smaller organisms like crabs, echinoids, shrimps, things along those lines, were that big durophagous tooth that Ptychodus has. There's really nothing out there today for it to work with, right?
Yeah.
Squids themselves, the larger cephalopods, your squids and things like that, they've gone to really deep water now, right? So they're off of the continental shelf. So they found an environment where they can get away from predators, and right now they're growing to colossal sizes, right? So the only really kind of the predators they got to worry about are sperm whales. But yet these giant squids, they were nowhere near that size during the Cretaceous. They're now reaching their peak as far as size is concerned. But there's nothing out there today in the oceans that a Ptychodus would like to eat on. So
Yeah.
that's the big that's the tall and the short of it, really.
And then when you look at what are eating things like sea turtles, for example, a lot of the animals that are currently eating those, they're really good generalists that don't rely specifically on them. Like one thing that comes to mind is a tiger shark.
Your shark.
They'll eat
Mm-hmm.
a sea turtle, but they'll also eat anything else.
They sure will. License plates and
And tires.
divers equipment, and tires. Yes, yes, absolutely. Those have been found in the gut contents of tigers. Yes.
And
So,
with sharks, I think a lot of the benefits from them that or a lot of the beneficial adaptations shifted towards generalization that we see nowadays, which is why Carcharinus is such a successful lineage that's currently alive, is that they're spectacular at eating basically anything. They can eat marine mammals, but then they can also eat small fish
mhm.
and anything in between.
Yeah, take a look at the diversity. It just in fishes alone, um, from the in Cretaceous to today, the diversity in fishes has just gone huge. So now all of a sudden, like you say, your food sources have just exponentially grown. And now it's good for you now to be a carchariniform because you don't have to be a 20-foot, 25, 30-foot shark to survive. You can still do great work. You can still have a great population and thrive if being only a 5-foot shark.
Hmm.
A 2.5, 3 meters at max. So you can have a great lineage today, feeding off of the diversity that there is. And say during the Cretaceous, you didn't have large things like mammals. You had to scavenge if you were a lamniform, uh, Cretoxorhina, Squalocorax, Cretaceous. You had to scavenge on, your large animals like that are going to be your mosasaurs, your plesiosaurs, your polycotylids. So even then, you still had a limited food source for your larger things to eat compared to today, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and we still have some of these, benthic durophages where it seems like that is a pretty consistent and a really successful body plan that chondrichthyans still have, nailed down. Like heterodontus, the
Mm-hmm.
heterodontiforms are immensely successful, even though they're not, super species diverse. They're still, right now, I believe most of them are least concern, and they're able to consume these small benthic
Yes.
durophagus things.
Yes.
And then the
Yep.
myelobatids are a great example as well on the batoid side of things.
Yes. And again, take a look at their food sources. I keep going back to that. I feel like I'm a broken record on this, but heterodontids have found a great way to adapt themselves to live within those coral reefs. I mean, there is just a plethora of hard-shelled, crabs and shrimps and things like that, and they can have their way. There is nobody out competing heterodontists in those environments. And the thing about that shark with the name heterodontus, it's got the grasping teeth, the sharp grasping teeth in front where it can shoot out and fast grab that object, whether it's a crab, and then bring it in and then just really use those multiform teeth to crunch it. So they've got a little bit more of an advantage that way too. So they're more of a hide behind a couple of pieces of coral or a couple of pieces of rock and just wait for it to come by and just scoop that jaw or shoot that jaw out, suction it in, and crunch it up before the crab even knows what happens. Yeah,
Yeah.
and your skates are doing the same thing. They're just sifting through the sands, sucking up like a vacuum cleaner. anything that gets in their way. They've got a great mode. They don't have to compete with any of the other big, large myliobatiforms that are out there in the open ocean. So everybody's found their niche and become highly successful in those,
For sure.
even though they all have a durophagous dentition.
Yeah, that makes sense. It was great having you on, Shawn. So one question that I like to ask everyone that I have on this podcast before we wrap up is if you were to make any breakthrough discovery, what would that discovery be?
That's a great question. I would definitely would like to find a skeleton of a low-crowned Ptychodus, something like a Polygyrus, a martini, or a marginalis. I would definitely like to see what the body plan for that tooth form is. I don't know. Is it going to be more ray-like, or is it going to be just a larger version, lamniform body type with just larger teeth, different size teeth? Or is it going to be something completely different altogether that nobody really, could see coming? So that would be my
Yeah.
big discovery that I would like to see. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to see that too, so go find that.
Yes, I'm doing my best. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great having you on, Shawn. And for those that have stuck to the end, I know that you're shark nerds. So please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts on Ptychodus. What do you think? Do you think that they're a lamniform? Do you think there's something else? Let us know in the comments.